Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Philip Stern, Associate Professor of History at Duke. And we're talking about his book, Empire Incorporated, The Corporations That Built British Colonialism. Really excited about this topic. Dr. Stern, wonderful to have you on today.
Thanks, PJ. It's really great to be here. I really appreciate you having me.
So let's start off with, as a first question, why this book? Why do we need a history of the British Empire from the corporation's standpoint?
I can tell you, that's a good question. So why do we need it? I'll tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from, why I wrote it, and then maybe I can give you a few clues as to why I think we need it. So I wrote a book about 12 years ago. I published a book called The Company State, which was a history of the British Empire in India. Is a work that looked at the early history of the East India Company, which historians had long taken to be a story about how a commercial company had sort of suddenly, somehow, times accidentally, turned into an empire in India in the middle of the 18th century. This story didn't quite sit well with me. It didn't make a lot of sense. And as I looked back into it, the story I ended up writing in that book was a story about how actually, by its nature as a corporation and by its nature as a kind of early modern trading enterprise, the East India Company was founded in 1600 and it really expanded as a territorial empire in the late 18th century, so 150 some odd years later. What I argued in that book and kind of looked at were the ways in which the company, by its nature as a corporation and its nature kind of as a transnational commercial entity in a kind of early modern world, was by its nature kind of political in a form of governance, right? This company in the 17th century minted coins, it flew flags, it built forts, it maintained an army, but most importantly, it governed over people, made laws, even governed over whether they lived or died, and these sorts of things. And so this was, I started that book. I did that book as a historian of the British Empire in India, not as a historian of corporations, but I kind of converted me in some way. I got kind of really interested. And then I've said this to people before, after I finished that book, I started looking to see where those ideas would go. And I started to have a kind of existential crisis because I just saw corporate states everywhere. These ideas, and I couldn't miss them. It was like when you learn a new word and then you just can't stop seeing it everywhere. And but what was interesting about it as I got more into it was I also kind of challenged myself because I'd written a book about the company state. This concept has been taken up by other scholars as well. But it turned out that not all the companies I was seeing looked like company states. The East India Company was both typical in a larger ecology of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these colonial companies over time, but it also was different. And there were companies of all different shapes and sizes. Many failed, many imploded, many were just scams from the outset. There was just a wide variety of this phenomenon that seemed to really be fueling colonial expansion. So I wanted to look at that and sort of explore that across a much longer period of time than that book had. The book had covered about 80 to 100 years. This one covers about 400 and much more across the globe, looking at this phenomenon in a variety of different ways. So that's why I need the book. Why do you need the book, or why does someone else need the book? I would give a couple of answers to that question. One is that I wrote this book because I am very interested as a scholar in thinking about the ways we naturalize certain assumptions about how the world works and looking at whether those assumptions are true and whether we want to, how we might see, say, past past those assumptions into by using the past to understand the present. And in this case, it's about looking at the ways in which bodies outside the state, what we might think of as private power, though I think they often thought of themselves as very public institutions, really do exercise forms of governance. Our are forms of political community and forms of government, and in many cases, forms of sovereignty. Except in the modern world, we tend to think that's only states, nations, countries that do that kind of work. And so by looking to the past, all of these things where maybe we can see clearly, maybe it's something we look to the present and are able to maybe understand a little better how various forms of institutions have control and authority and jurisdiction over our lives, and we give that kind of authority to them. And so if we kind of break down our assumptions that companies do business and trade, commerce, and states do governance and politics, and see that they're really intertwined and overlapping, then it really helps us to see how power works much more clearly, I suppose. I'd say more inside baseball, when it comes to the history of the British Empire, what I was trying to do with this, and European empires more generally, what I was trying to do with this book was to kind of unseat some of the assumptions historians tend to make about the narratives, the patterns that history follows. They tend to divide that history into kind of, say, often we hear about a first and second British Empire, one that like in the 17th and 18th centuries is focused on America, and then after the American Revolution sort of shifted east. Famous historian in the mid 20th century called it the swing to the east. It became like by the 19th and 20th centuries a sort of Asian and African empire. But in fact, that transition is not nearly as abrupt, and it's not nearly as complete as one might expect. I was particularly interested in this book in upsetting distinctions in the literature about empires that distinguishes between what you might call formal and informal empires. So for years, we've had this idea that there were two kinds of empires going on. One that was formal, that is to say, boots on the ground, painted red on the map, forms, colonial government, and then kind of informal empires of influence, backed by financial power, maybe with the threat of violence, but really operating through other kinds of institutions. And what I saw was a much more pockmarked and hybrid kind of entity. Places like in Latin America, where the British Empire was said to have only informal influence, you saw actual real forms of governance. They were small. It was localized. Maybe it wasn't territory in the shape you might imagine. It might be over the corridor of a railway leading from one coast to another. It might be on a mahogany plantation or something like that. But this was actually real power that operated on real lives. What I like to say is that informal empire didn't necessarily feel informal to the people who were subject to it, right? And there's other things I'm sort of interested in thinking about. But the bottom line is that by shifting the gaze, and in the book I kind of call it, like, think of it like a minor character narrative. If you take something like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, or Grendel, or Wicked, I think might be the one that's most popular to most people, where you take a minor character in the normal narrative, put them at the center of the story, and you show what the story looks like from their perspective. And it changes how you feel about the story. And in this case, it creates a much more continuous, if fragmented, kind of story, because it's about all these different institutions at war with each other, in conflict with each other. And that's probably the last thing that I would say in my little extended monologue. I'm sorry for going on for so long. Which is that I think that one of the things I was tracing was how the British Empire was built in many respects at war with itself, if you could think about it that way. And that story is not meant to minimize or dismiss violence against other Europeans, particularly against indigenous peoples. It's actually to show how the internecine, or the internal violence, permitted, enabled, was paved the way for those forms of dispossession and violence, because it naturalized conflict. That, in the colonial American period, for example, a lot of our listeners may be familiar with that. There really wasn't a quote unquote British colony that didn't have some major conflict, including violent conflict, with its neighbor over its borders and boundaries in a variety of ways. And that had to do a lot with the fact that these forms of colonies were not just emanating from the center out, but were being constructed by these different institutional forms locally. But anyway, hopefully that persuades you, or persuades people that one needs the book. But I think it's really all on the theme of this question of exactly how do we think about the blurry lines between private and public power, private and public sovereignty.
Well, and I had Dr. Meg Leah on to talk about Carolingian medicine and religion, which is pretty esoteric, most people would think. But one of the things we talked about is how in history people want the big narrative, because it's hard to, that's just how most people think about history. Outside of the history department, it's like, well, there's like Waterloo, and then there's like, even as you talk about that shift, that's how we first start understanding things, right? We don't think about all the fragmentation because it takes work to get into the details. But what the value of the details that you're talking about is that's where we start to break apart those assumptions. So, for instance, one of the things that came up is she focused a lot on the transmission of medicine through Carolingian Europe. And so one of the things that really struck me is you talked about naturalizing assumptions. And that what's interesting is the layers of assumptions. And so, I remember a time before a personal computer. Like I remember getting my first personal computer. I remember social media. And, that's something we talk about because it's within our memory. But the interesting thing about history, and even like her time period, is she was talking about a time before the printing press. And we don't even think about how much of our thoughts on information are based on, like, I was like sitting there thinking about copying by hand, right? And like, even it's like, you can get so caught up in like the recent developments, you can miss the power structures or the knowledge structures in like things that have been going on for centuries. And so anyways, I really, and what that does is if we don't break apart those naturalized assumptions, then we become subject to these power structures that we're not even aware are there, right? Like as you were talking about these institutions. That's a long-winded way to, but when we talk about big questions, I think sometimes I feel maybe this isn't right, but I do feel this need to defend history. Why do I include history in this? And like people are like, well, who cares about corporations and British like? And it's like, no, you don't understand. This is all our story, right? We're all like weaving this together, and these assumptions are built into it. One of the things, I mean, just immediately stuck out to me is you said transnational versus multinational, because what I wanted to ask you about was multinational corporations. What's the difference, and what is that transition from transnational to multinational?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think some people tend to use the word concept interchangeably, and sometimes we think about them kind of analytically differently. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not sure that there is actually a smooth transition from companies that, exist in multiple places at once and ones that cross borders with great frequency. So I think, many multinationals are in fact transnational in that respect, and so I think that it's a good question. I mean, I think the bigger point you're kind of driving at is, and I really appreciate you having, I mean, me, but also historians in to talk, because I really do think, for a couple of reasons, that's really important. I like to say, I mean, I wrote this book about the history of the British Empire. I really do hope people who could care less about the history of the British Empire will see something important to read and think about in this book, if for no other reason than many of the foundations that are laid in this book, or not laid in this book, but laid in the story the book tells, still with us today. Not just the kind of international order that's created by colonialism and decolonization, but even many of the companies in the book still exist in some form or another, either literally, companies that still endure from that period, maybe some we don't even associate with that colonial past, and others that kind of exist buried in the DNA of modern companies and corporations in a variety of ways. So that history, what I say in the book is, I think it's really important that we think about history as genealogy, not analogy, right? So we don't just dig into the past to look for comparisons, but we actually can see how things develop over time. And like genealogy is like a family tree. You might be genetically related to your ancestors, but you're also different, and you've mixed in a variety of different ways with other influences, both nature and nurture. And so context matters. But you can see in that past the germs of the story we have in the present. Even more importantly, though, than that, I think, and I talk about this in the book as well, that looking into the past, it's like it's going to another country. I mean, literally is a global story, so we are going to another country, but it's like looking in a different place and time, as you just sort of said, so that we get distant from ourselves, so we can kind of maybe see more clearly the things that we take for granted and those assumptions. And one of the things that this book kind of tries to say is, I think a lot of histories, the corporation try to definitively say, well, I'll look at the past or I'll look at the present. I'll tell you a corporation is X or a corporation is Y, or this is what we should do with it. My kind of conclusion was that what the past tells us is that there is this deep, long history going back to the 12th and 13th centuries in some respect, back to your Carolingians in some sense, that um, uh, that almost bake the paradox and the dilemmas of the corporation into its DNA, into what it actually is. So looking to the past can help us realize that these are not modern phenomena, but that going back to its medieval origins, the corporation is a kind of legal concept. I mean, the very fact that the corporation comes not from a commercial legal tradition, but really comes from the medieval church and medieval empires as a way of organizing political communities. When you think about like corporations, ways of organizing the Catholic structures in the Catholic Church, as well as urban corporations, cities. Many people listening will be living in towns and cities that are corporations and not ever really have thought about it, right? Or have gone to universities that are corporations and not have thought about it, or go to churches that are corporations and not have really thought about it. So you think about the fact that this is a model that stretches well beyond that. We instinctively, colloquially think today. You hear corporation, you think, oh, business, but it's actually a much broader phenomenon that's about just kind of figuring out and ordering the kinds of communities and associations that we live in and interact in our lives, and that helps us to kind of understand it. But what that also does is it helps us to see how it's very hard to get your arms around what the business corporation is, because it's got these different elements in it, right? Is it a person? I mean, we talk a lot about corporate personhood in this country, or is it a society? Is it a private body? We think of it kind of as a private entity, but also is it a public body with public responsibilities? As you try to negotiate, what is its responsibility? Is it to profit or to social good, right? These are the kinds of questions you have to go back in the past to kind of see, where did this thing come from? If you want to have any arguments or answers about what it should be in the future, I think just to answer, well, the law says it is X, is a very limited way, I think, of grappling with the problems of the world. It might be a good way of arguing a lawsuit, but it's not a great way of sort of thinking about what you want the world to look like in a certain respect. And I will say, to be very clear, I try to steer away in the book from telling you what it should be like. I mean, I like people to draw those own conclusions in some way, but part of the book is about exposing the questions, and you'll find many companies in the book that will trouble you by trying to get a bead on exactly what you think they are. You go to it with a certain set of assumptions. Well, they must be in it for profit, and then you find out that the corporation is there, for, say, missionary activities, or that it's actually by a bunch of people who had some bizarre philosophical experiment and were, in a sense, exercising that on indigenous peoples halfway around the world, or how people were sort of, it was a philanthropic experiment, but it was a philanthropic experiment that somehow intersected with the dispossession of indigenous territories. I mean, so it helps you to sort of see the complexities that go into something as world historical and transformative as something like empire, and that helps you, I think, to think about something as world historical and transformative as modern capitalism or something like that as well.
Yeah, I love that, you talk about cutting off assumptions, or I'm sorry, assertions, right? That you want people to create their own. And what I've found that's really fascinating as I have thought more about this question of, like, what is the point of history, is that it's more about creating fertile ground to find solutions now. It's actually more creative than people realize. It's about not necessarily about drawing like equation type answers out, but about allowing us to be creative about the present, and hopefully our future. So well said. Thank you. I do want to, I would love to just press you a little bit about that movement from ecclesiastical law to what we now know as corporations. And part of the reason is I'm still a little bit annoyed that when I moved into my new house, that I did not realize that it was unincorporated, my town. So I missed it by half a mile, and so I have to pay for a library card. And I'm not gonna lie, it still annoys me a little bit. So I would love to have this explained to me, like why I have to pay for a library card because I'm unincorporated rather incorporated.
If only I had known to be able to include that in the book, that would have been very helpful.
That would,
I feel your pain. But I just not to interrupt you, but I take the point. It affects us. These kinds of questions affect us at such local and global and substantive level. It digs deep into sort of very everyday life. I mean, it's interesting when you say that, because I think about something else, which is, so when I talk to my students about these kinds of questions, and they say, well, what does it matter? Government is government, right? And I'm like, well, where do you find government? Where do you find power, right? You find it in all of the different ways in which it operates on your life, including, in some sense, your library card, right? I mean, for many people, actually, I mean, historians like to write it. You talk about big narratives, and we like to write about diplomacy. We like to write about war. We like to write about, high level politics. But for most people, it actually operates at these very day-to-day levels about, like, how do you get a library book? How do you send a letter through the mail? Like, how do you, things we do on a day-to-day basis. And that's where we look. And then you look at those and you say, in some places we see that's done by something we might think of as a public entity, like a government agency. And a lot of places you see it being run by businesses, by private entities, and those have different representative politics. They have different structures. They have different implications about how much money they cost and where that money comes from. And if you live in an unincorporated county or an incorporated town, how you're represented in politics makes a difference, and how that operates. So, anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but in many respects, it seems like a small thing. I don't minimize your anger and frustration. I totally get it. But I'm joking. It's I mean, it's amazing how these, and you see that. I mean, I've seen this in the book. This can, so when I talk about corporations, for example, I got, a lot about the East India Company. I can't get away from the East India Company in some respects. It's so big and outsized, and not only for scholars, but actually for the people in my book, the East India Company, even after it ceases to be a government of colonial India. I mean, it has been fueled so much of my scholarly interest is this bizarre idea that a company essentially created such a massive and transformative and violent empire for hundreds of years, right? But what's also interesting, and it's the other sense in my book that I use the term empire incorporated. In one sense, it's about a bunch of corporations that sort of fuel empire in a way you hadn't thought about. But it's also about how the state over time incorporates and absorbs those companies into its empire. So in 1858, British India ceases to be a company empire and becomes the crown empire. And I talk a little about that in the book. But even after that happens, and everybody's supposed to have said, well, that was a terrible idea. Why did we ever let a company be an empire? And that's an important point, by the way, as a parenthetical. A lot of the opposition to companies is not an opposition to colonialism. It's essentially an argument over how to do what's the best effective way to do colonialism. So it doesn't exactly exonerate the opponents of the companies from their complicity and culpability. But but for the next 50 to 80 years, it was striking to me as I was writing this book, how many people came back, including famous philosophers like John Stuart Mill, who, not surprisingly, had, in this sense, because he had also been an East India Company administrator early in his career, wrote eloquently and forcefully about how actually we lost something. Not we, nothing to do with me, but how the empire had lost something by losing this kind of company form. So the model just keeps coming back and back and again. But just say, sort of with that, but back to your library card example, there's all these profound examples, and they're very important. The East India Company, which rules over the largest portion of the British Empire, companies that are the Royal African Company, which is responsible for transforming the British Empire into a slave trading operation. Companies that are deeply implicated and in fact drive the scramble for African colonization in the late 19th century, right? But there's also this other side to the story of the corporation and empire, which is about how important the corporation was to producing civil society and making colonialism and settlement endure. in a day-to-day life kind of way. So I talk a lot, for example, about, or not a lot, but I talk at various points in the book about various universities, like Yale University, which happens to actually be named after a former East India Company administrator who donated a whole bunch of books to the university and they took his name, and then I don't think ever really delivered his donation in full.
Huh.
So there's also a lot of stories about people who don't pay their bills in this book, which is what corporations also sort of allow, or about as you said, so you mentioned religious institutions, but also learned societies, and towns and cities that is to local government. These also need corporations to manage land, to manage governance. This is, in many respects, I make the argument this is the formative way in which, especially in New England, but in general in North America, the North American colonies expanded themselves was by reproducing joint stock towns, across as they moved westward and westward, including one very bizarre story, which I'm quite obsessed with, and I think it will be developing into a much larger project about a company that out of Connecticut that attempts to settle in the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania, near current day Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. Even though there was another English colony there, Pennsylvania, and especially knowing that there were, of course, overlapping indigenous peoples and nations there, including the Iroquois, and so the company form reproduces these various ways of organizing life, everything from library cards to war making, and that's what's so fascinating about the whole enterprise, to me at least.
Yeah, I wanted to ask specifically, and maybe I misunderstood. You mentioned that the idea of the corporation comes out of the church. Is that because was it something that came out of ecclesiastical law that split in medieval? I understand this a little bit before the book, but that I'm sure that gets us into some of the questions of things like IPOs, municipal bonds, corporate finance. Yeah, it is buried in this structure. Did that come out of? I didn't realize that it did it come out of the ecclesiastical court or ecclesiastical
So
laws?
it is, it's a premise of the book. I think I mentioned it very briefly. I wish I had more space and honestly more words allowed to me in the book to get into all these things more deeply. But yeah, so the legal idea of the corporation as a body of individuals, or perhaps even one individual, who can be made by law into a separate but related entity that can act in law, right? Sue and be sued, or hold debts, hold property in the name of the corporation rather than the name of the individual or individuals that make up the corporation. That is a legal concept that's developed in the medieval period to grapple with kind of simultaneously and related two places, that were presenting legal governance quandaries. One was the nature of church authority, papal authority over bishoprics, abbots, over local church governance, and the nature of imperial authority in something like the Holy Roman Empire over local governance, particularly cities and urban spaces. And kind of quasi-related to that is its development of concepts in, say, the Italian city-states as well in the late medieval and early modern period, right? So my point is that all of this stuff you're talking about kind of comes in when you start to fuse in, and it's very much related to commercial life. I mean, the urban corporations of medieval Europe were primarily organized in many respects to self-govern, but who were the people there but for merchants self-organizing. So then corporate form then begins to inform things like guilds and guild structures and then eventually by the time you get into the 16th and 17th centuries, it starts to be applied to mercantile companies, a variety of forms. And in my book, the one I'm looking at most particularly is the joint stock company, which is kind of a latecomer to using this corporate form. And that a joint stock company being, of course, a kind of company that, unlike a guild, where each individual or partnership of traders trades on their own accord, but under a set of common rules and regulations and privileges, a joint stock company is a single body that in which everybody, through some form of shareholding, and it was very varied at this point, right? It didn't look like it does today. Shares could come in various forms, but through some form of shareholding, essentially participated in a common entity and gave over the governance to a common government, which we now think of as a board of directors or a CEO or something like that. So I don't know if that makes sense or seems clear, but I guess from my perspective, by fusing the joint stock company model with the corporation model, you're actually not just creating a commercial technology that can raise capital or raise great amounts of debt, be infinitely more liquid, be much more risk tolerant, all of these things we tend to talk about when we talk about kind of the birth of modern capitalism, but it's also a form of governance. It's an argument for how things should be, how you govern by giving over to a kind of common government rather than a bunch of individual traders trading on their own accord. If you'll sort of indulge me, the medieval genealogy, the medieval legacy there becomes fascinating. And this is kind of what I mean when I say in the book that the corporation is sort of from its origins a paradox, right? Because, and I will admit to your listeners that you gave me permission to go geeky and nerd and deep, so I'm gonna go with it. But my argument in the book is that the premise or the argument in the book is that out of this medieval tradition comes the philosophical tradition of the corporation as a legal and philosophical principle, come two traditions that lead into modern political theory. One is the idea of pluralism, right? And it's the one that's most obviously associated with the corporation. For example, you and I, I associate this most particularly with a 17th century political theorist, Protestant political theorist, Johannes Althusius. But it kind of it makes its way into the modern period through into the early 20th century, through into a group of English philosophers who tend to be known collectively as pluralists, the English pluralists. And the idea here is that corporate theory allows us to understand society as made up of many different overlapping but independent political communities, right? So it's a kind of challenge to the idea of a singular state, that we all belong to different communities at once, and they all have different forms of authority, right? You might belong to, you might have be a citizen of a nation, but you're also a member of a church, a member of a union, a member of a club, or a variety of different ways in which these, and particularly also cities and other levels of government. So a kind of other version of, or sort of offshoot, that's not a thing, an offshoot of this this kind of pluralist theory is what we think of as federalism. The idea that there's government at every different level, and it's not, we tend to, I think, casually, if you don't study this, or you're not a lawyer, or you don't think, well, cities are subordinate to states and states are subordinate to the federal government. But if you actually look at how this works, right, companies that can incorporate in one jurisdiction so that they can evade or get different taxes than another jurisdiction. Sometimes it's international, and sometimes it's even among states. Cities that insist on the autonomy of their laws to reject federal or state law. Conflicts of laws. You've seen this in a variety of different forms of law in federal law, like states and localities that in fact have laws that contradict federal law, or that have laws that are different than other states, right? So we have all of these questions, and it's never always clear which one precedes the other, right? But the corporation also gives you a completely different stream towards modernity. And that is that it's corporate theory and the idea of the fictional person, a lot of people made into a singular entity that is abstract and eternal, and it has succession. That is the major theory that allows for us to think about the modern state and modern state sovereignty, singular sovereignty. And the most iconic example of this, if anybody listening is familiar with the front page, the frontispiece to Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, it is quite literally the sovereign made up of the bodies of all the people of the polity, literally the body politic, right? And so corporate theory, and other scholars have looked at this and seen that how corporate theory underlies someone like Thomas Hobbes's absolutist theory of governance. So you can see that if this makes sense, I don't know if it makes sense. Corporate theory gives you both an idea of civil society is made up of lots of different centers, and civil society is made up of one hierarchical center where everything else is subordinate to it. And so I think when you think about that, it helps you to see the paradox at the heart of the corporation, the modern business corporation. Is it subject to national law? Is it a citizen of a national state? Or is it its own form of sovereignty or its own form of independent jurisdiction in relation to those states? You asked about transnational, multinational corporations. What happens when they exceed the boundaries of those states? We colloquially will think of something as an American company or a British company, right? But that may be where its articles of incorporation are. But is it that, in fact, where its offices are? Is that where it's paying taxes? And how do you hold it responsible when one of those entities deems it to have committed a crime or to have exceeded its mandate in some way, right? So you get these kind of almost paradox at the core of the theory, and it's not just that that's interesting in and of itself, but it really helps you to sort of, I think, see, when I was going back to what I said earlier, how the past can help you to really take a step back and think, oh, I get it. That's why this is why I don't quite understand what I'm supposed to think about the power of these corporations. Because on the one hand, I think of them as, subordinate to, we think of nations as sort of having laws that govern over these things, but somehow they evade them all the time and push back. Or why is legislation in the EU affecting how Apple or Google does its business in the US, and how are these things sort of interrelated and transformed over time? So this helps you, I think, to understand why this is, what the implications of that happening are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the average person, I think, everything works so smoothly that they don't really think about it. But like they had to write out and figure out things like, even within the states in the United States, licensing, like marriage licenses passing back and forth, driver's licenses passing back and forth. And every once in a while, some kind of odd thing will pop up where it's like, wait, this marriage license works over here, this marriage license doesn't work over here, or driver's license. And extradition, of course, across countries, across states, that had to be smoothed out or doesn't smooth out. I mean, that's kind of, what you mentioned there. A strange example. Go ahead.
I was going to say, just parenthetically, and I think you can trace a lot of that back, and other people have done more work on this than have in the United States history, trace that back to the fact that many of these states, especially the original ones, originated as colonies that identified themselves as corporations or corporate-like entities, right? In that sense. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. And here's one, and I don't know if this would be useful or not. To me, it immediately strikes me. When I first started podcasting, I tried to use a different camera, and independent filmmakers use these Canon film cameras. I don't know if you know where I'm going with this. They have a limit. They're great for shooting video. It's gorgeous. You can show it on a big screen, like in the theater, and it works fine. They have a limit of 29 minutes and 59 seconds, and they will turn off. And the first time it happened, I couldn't figure out what was going on, because I was like, that's very specific. It always turns off at that time. It has nothing to do with the capabilities of the camera. They have an automatic built-in switch, because in the EU, it gets taxed as a different bracket for a video camera than as a still camera, even though it takes, I was like, why does that affect me? But it's because of this multinational, transnational corporation operating in different, and then there's all these weird workarounds that are legal or not legal. And so, this is something that these are the underlying assumptions that govern our lives. The one thing I did kind of wanted to ask, the one thing that keeps popping up as you're talking is this idea of kind of responsibility and who's responsible for what and how are they responsible. And even as you talk about joint stock operation or joint stock corporations, there seems to be even this idea of diffusing responsibility, right? Like not any one person's responsible. You have it's like concentrating and diffusing. There's that paradoxical nature. How did that affect the structure of colonialism throughout the British Empire.
Yeah, I mean, at least in the way that I tell the story in this book, from this perspective, it's fundamental, right? In a variety of ways. I'll just name a few, to just not because I could talk about this for the whole hour, really. One is, one is, I call it in the book, the phrase I use in the book is what I call portfolio colonialism, right? The idea that you have joint stock corporations that are fueling colonialism at any given point in time means that individuals can kind of partake of colonialism. They can be responsible for funding and on some very basic level governing colonialism in all these different parts of the world, just simply by owning shares in all these different companies at once, right? We don't think about, a lot of people, very passive shareholders these days. And I think there were a lot of passive shareholders at the time as well. And that's a really important point, which is also to realize that many people were complicit in this colonial enterprise because they bought stocks for many different reasons. I think one of the mistakes we make is to read back into the past the idea that people say they own shares primarily in a cost-benefit analysis for making profit, right? Shareholding was often in these companies a rather social enterprise. You did it because your friends were doing it, or you did it for political capital, or you did it because your allies were doing it. It might have been a familial enterprise. You bought stocks because your family was involved in it in some way. It might have been an ideological thing, right? Or it may have been a religious motivation. You contributed because it was something you saw as a kind of religious mission because of what these colonial enterprises were doing. So people bought stocks for various reasons, but it created this much greater foundation, much more deeply implicated in society, both financially and politically, for these colonial enterprises, right? The second answer I give to that is that the legal consequences of diffusing, and I don't know, I wouldn't argue that it's a conscious plan. It's something that evolves and develops over time as a legal idea. The legal consequences of diffusing colonial sovereignty as a form of property of shareholding company participants as well as companies themselves is profound. Because one of the mistakes, so many people sort of come into this, and sort of one of the underlying, I wouldn't say even arguments of the book, but maybe just one of these things I just kind of keep shouting in the book in some way, right? Which is that, we tend to think, you tend to, and I get this from students, you hear this from people all the time, many of the companies until you get to the 19th century, the way you largely made a corporation was by getting a charter from the crown or eventually from parliament, right? And there's this kind of assumption we make that those charters, that the crown's kind of had absolute authority. It gave the charter and it could take the charter away, right? It made you and it could break you, right? But that's actually not how it worked legally. Often giving out a charter was much easier than taking it back. There were rather convoluted legal processes you had to go through, the crown had to go through to almost basically sue the corporation to get the charter back, to cancel the charter. Sometimes what the crown did, actually more often than not, when government had a desire to kind of dilute or undermine the power of a corporation, it couldn't take the charter away so much as it would just create new charters and just give them to other people that would overlap with those charters, even though those charters were by definition exclusive monopolies, right? And remember those border disputes I mentioned before. Like that's how you get. I mean, so just as an aside, I'll get back to your point about the shareholders in a second. But as an aside, that example I mentioned before of the Connecticut company that tries to create a colony inside of Pennsylvania, the legal argument foundation for that is that in the Connecticut charter, the western boundary of Connecticut was theoretically what they called the South Seas, the Pacific, which was a very vague geographical concept at the time. But the northern boundary of Pennsylvania overlapped with the western boundary in law. If you were to draw it out, and I actually had some students once do this through digital mapping, and there was basically this Venn diagram where there were these overlapping charters, even though both charters were supposed to be exclusive monopoly, right? So it creates this conflict that has no resolution. No obvious legal resolution. It's something you litigate, you argue, you say. In the case of this Susquehanna company that I'm talking about in Pennsylvania, there are actually armed conflicts between Pennsylvanians and these Connecticut settlers several times. So it's worked out in a variety of different ways, but the implications of this being both the property of a body like the corporation and the body of shareholders means that there are many times that when Crown or Parliament or some British court or British government agency was trying to rein in these charters or take them back, where the companies would make the legal argument rather effectively, actually at times, that to do so was not only to violate the sovereignty of this kind of entity, this colony, but actually to violate the property rights of all of the individual shareholders that had this tiny little bit of slice of share in this sovereign entity, as well as all of its actual material. Like there were actually was what they called dead stock. There was actually things they owned, ships, forts, infrastructure, right? In my book, one of the most fascinating things, I wish, I mean, to be honest, it's just, keep this between me and you. No one's listening, right? I would, yeah, no, I mean, I treat it in the book, but I really wish I had, you finish a book and there's so many things you just wish you had more time to talk about. So you come on podcasts and you just make people listen to you talk about it. But at the,
great.
Yeah, one of the things I traced in this book that was incredibly fascinating to me, and actually something I didn't know as much about when I started the book as when I finished the book, which was a wonderful process, was how hard it was when even these companies wanted willingly to be taken over by the state, because as these companies, when the East India Company is taken over by the state, or these late 19th century African companies are taken over by the state, they're not just taken over; they have to actually be bought out. People have property rights in their investments. But what is I mean, put it abstractly, and actually there were some theorists at the time who put it almost literally this way: what is the price of sovereignty? Right? So you can put a value on a ship, you can put a value even on a fort, but how did you put a value on the right of governance? And so there was never any way to settle, like, what was this company worth? And the debates were really telling, right? So we have this idea that why can't government just go in and take over the company, right? Well, because there are these laws that the political culture and the law regard as inviolable, and one of them is a sort of private property right. So if you want to think of if you go back to our original, where we started, you want to ask, well, because company's doing this, why can't the government just go stop it? Well, you think a little bit about exactly how those companies can use the law to protect themselves and the rights of their shareholders. Now, think about that company is not just, making a product or something like that, but that company is actually ruling over peoples halfway around the world. And you really start to see how profound using this structure to create a kind of colonial environment is, how profoundly powerful it becomes. Now, don't get me wrong, there were many times where the government and state were complicit in this, encouraging of it, or they wanted to take it over just so they could do it themselves. It wasn't simply that the state comes in as a kind of white hat regulator that's trying to prevent this kind of corruption. That's not the story I want to tell, because it's not the story it's not how it happens, right? This is a debate where, for many people, I mean, there are critics of empire through this period. We shouldn't mistake that. There's one thing, we'll go back to why do we look at history? One thing that drives me crazy about when people talk about history is when they talk about history as if everybody in the past all had the same opinion about stuff, as if they don't live in the world today where you get, 3 people in a room and you get 4 opinions about things. I mean, you can't look at modern politics and look in the past and assume, oh, well, the British thought that, or this was the economic theory, or it was an absolutist state. At no point in time was there not vicious debate over how the world should look, right? That's the beauty of being an intellectual historian, which is part of what I think of myself as, right? Anyway, so so there are, but the majority of these conversations, the majority of these debates are about how to sustain empire. And it's a debate over the proper way to do it. So everybody's kind of implicated in that in some ways. But the fact that one version of this is saying it's shareholders who are doing it, it's boards of directors who are doing it. This is what John Stuart Mill essentially argues, that these people who do this singularly are far more expert then legislators who are whose constituents are some small town in northern England, what do they know about India? This company is the one that has the expertise. I mean, there's a lot of problems with that argument, but if you actually think about what the argument is like, and then you listen to, say, testimony about, from Silicon Valley companies in front of Congress, you hear very similar themes. I'm not comparing the two. I really want to be very careful. That's the analogy part that I think is problematic. This is not the same thing, but the questions are similar about where the boundaries of power, the boundaries of autonomy and power are, if that makes sense. And there's more I could say about this, the shareholding stuff, but it's really kind of goes very deep into the whole thing. It's the key, and including also the financial side. I talked just about the politics, but the financial side of being a shareholder company, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is the capacity of these companies to go into massive amounts of debt. They essentially, the pledges of shares, especially for companies that are territorial companies in a variety of ways, is the most bizarre structure. It's almost like a multi-level marketing scheme in some way, where you pledge money or your labor to a company for a piece of land halfway around the world the company doesn't really own except on paper. And the only way to actualize that colonial power is for you or people you pay for to go there, fight off the indigenous peoples, claim the land, put down roots, and turn it into a productive territory, and then sublease it or sell it to others and subdivide it and re-grant it and these sorts of things till eventually, there's nothing there, right? I mean, kind of joking about it being kind of a pyramid scheme, but it does look a little like a pyramid, right? So, and so it really helps you to sort of understand the kind of feats of imagination and twists of law and finance that you needed to make something as really profound and transformative as empire happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, even as you're talking about this, you talk about the violence spilling over, where you have indigenous peoples getting caught in border disputes between companies, where it would be very different if you were just, I mean, as soon as you get more than two people negotiating, it's just going to get crazier and crazier, right? I mean, and all I could think of the whole time is the way that to me, it changes the way I hear the common phrase, possession is 9/10 of the law, where it's like you have people doing these protracted, long legal disputes. And meanwhile, the profit is given to the people who have boots on the ground, right? And the military power. And I'm really struck too by, as you're talking about this, the difference between negotiation between one person and the way that social inertia is created and the debate is widened by adding several hundred people to a company, and they all have a vested interest, right? All of a sudden, we're not talking about like you can get two people in a room talking, and if I can sit down with a mediator, we can hash this out. It's like, no, you have to convince, you have to get the board convinced, and and what ends up happening is that stuff takes time, which means there's just an inertia to the sheer complexity of what's being created. Am I tracking with on that? Like, is that part of the story you're telling here?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that though is inside a company as well as outside the company, there's not necessarily any guarantee people will agree on the best way to get to their interests. So
Right.
one of the points, so one of the things, one of the big questions, right, is always sort of like, to talk about the company versus the state, like we've been kind of talking here abstractly, is to miss something that's true today as it was back then. Members of parliament are shareholders of companies. Members of companies are administrators in government, right? I mean, it's not a one-to-one overlap. It is as untrue to suggest that the companies are in locked, pitched battle with the state at all times as it is to suggest the other thing I'm pushing back on, which is that the companies are somehow some kind of outsourced or extension of the state, kind of only a plausible deniability. And that was actually an argument people made going back to the 16th century for these charters. It's all of these things are true at various times. Humphrey Gilbert is one of the early kind of colonial projectors of the 16th century, literally argues to Queen Elizabeth, you should give me a charter, because if Spain comes to you and says, why are you encroaching our territory? You can say, oh, it wasn't me, it was that guy, right? And so, but that's not the whole story. At various times, these entities overlap and these individuals overlap, and at various times they absolutely detest one another. There was one of the leading voices in the British Colonial Office in the early 19th century, was very hostile to the idea of company colonialism, and thought that one of the leading theorists of company colonialism, who was the guy who was behind this enterprise of settling a colony in South Australia, was one of the most odious individuals he had ever encountered his entire life. And he, in many respects actually was. But so it's not so simple. And so another example is that, if you look at the debates over the East India Company in the middle of the 18th century, after the East India Company acquires that sort of territorial power I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, in the 1750s and 1760s, there's massive debates in British Parliament and British public over what do you do about this? This seemed like a really transformative thing. Those debates were not like company people in Parliament versus non-company people in Parliament. There were actually lots of shareholders on both sides of the debate who were having the same debate in Parliament and in shareholder meetings. Like, what should we do, right? So it's not so easy as to sort of identify what people's interests are in that respect. And the other thing is someone who takes ideology, emotions, passions, irrational behavior really seriously in the past, if only because I am myself a very irrational person many, many times in my life, right? I like to be wary of trying to assume we can understand interest so clearly, because sometimes people's interests are infused by a lot of things that are interests, but they're not necessarily always rational financial interests. And, you see this all the time. People vote based on things that have, sometimes it has to do with their financial interests. Sometimes it has to do with their religious commitments or philosophical commitments or political beliefs, right? And you take all those motivations seriously to understand the full range of human experience that goes into these kinds of acts.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, but let me first off say what an enjoyable conversation it's been. And I just always really appreciate someone who is willing to complicate history in order to create more empathy and creativity for us today. So thank you, Dr. Stern. It's been awesome having you on today.